I need to admit something. There was a time in my life where cutting off my parents felt like it was the only answer. Not because I hated them, not because they were monsters, but because I was hurting. And when you hurt so long, distance can start to look like peace. I remember thinking, if they would just understand, if they would just acknowledge it, if they would just see what I see, then maybe things could finally get better. Maybe then I could move on, and maybe then I could heal. We have talked about why healing requires understanding our parents. We've talked about why blame feels satisfying but ultimately doesn't heal us. And we've also talked about how many of the patterns we inherited were passed down through generations as a survival strategies. And all of that understanding is important. But eventually, a question emerges. Now, what do I do with this relationship? Because understanding your parent doesn't magically erase the hurt. It doesn't automatically rebuild trust. And it doesn't tell you whether this relationship should become closer, stay the same, or become more distant. Today, I want to talk about the space between understanding and estrangement. Because I think a lot of people live in that space for years. I know I did. For people who know me, hearing that I came this close to cutting off my parents is unimaginable. I have been told multiple times in multiple different ways that the relationship that I had with my parents was enviable. Quite often, I would talk about my parents, and people often thought I was either living with them or they just lived a few blocks away from me. Not that they lived over 1,000 miles away and I only saw them in person maybe once or twice a year. But despite the daily talks on the phone and the smiles at family gatherings, our relationship did break down. It broke down so much that cutting them off seemed like the only option. I found myself still assigned to playing a family role that I had totally grown out of and no longer wanted to play. That caused friction, not necessarily between me and my parents, but inside me. The me inside was not being acknowledged or respected. I was constantly reminded that the person I had grown to be was not wanted and was not being heard. So I started this whole journey trying to understand my parents, what shaped them, how they thought, what they believed, just so that I could finally be able to explain to them in the right way who I was and what I needed from them. And when I finally started to confront them about it, it blew up in my face multiple times. For a long time, I thought I wanted understanding. But if I'm being honest, what I really wanted was a different ending. I wanted the movie version, the scene where everyone sits down, the truth finally comes out, everyone understands each other, someone gives a beautiful apology, everyone cries, music swells, and credits roll. Unfortunately, family relationships rarely hire Hollywood screenwriters. Most healing happens in a much messier way. And one of the hardest things I had to accept was that understanding my parents did not guarantee that they would understand me. That was painful because a part of me believed that if I worked hard enough, explained clearly enough, and found the perfect words, eventually they would see everything exactly the way that I saw it. But people don't always work that way. Sometimes they can, and sometimes they can't. Sometimes they're willing, and sometimes they aren't. And healing requires making peace with that uncertainty. I think we also need to talk honestly about cutting family off. Because online, these conversations can become strangely casual. Someone shares a difficult family situation, and immediately 100 strangers appear out of nowhere saying,
Cut them off.
Go no contact.
Remove them from your life.
and listen. Sometimes distance is absolutely necessary. Some relationships are abusive, some relationships are unsafe, and some relationships cause ongoing harm. And I want to be clear about that. But I also think cutting off a parent is one of the biggest relationship decisions a person can make. Because you aren't just changing one relationship, you're often changing an entire system. Because sometimes people take sides. Family dynamics can change. Your relationship with your siblings may change. Your relationship with your extended family, your nieces, nephews, cousins, and future generations. Your holiday traditions and family stories, it can all change. Very rarely does cutting off one family relationship only affect that relationship. And I say that not to create guilt, not to convince anyone to stay in an unhealthy situation, but because I think decisions this significant deserve thoughtfulness, not just pain. Pain can tell us something is wrong, but pain alone shouldn't be making all the decisions. At some point, I stopped asking, do I have the right to be hurt? And started asking, what am I hoping that happens next? That question changed everything. Because up until then, I was focused entirely on the past, on what happened, what didn't happen, what should have happened. But healing eventually asks us to look forward to the future. What do I actually want now? Do I want acknowledgement, understanding, an apology? Do I want a different relationship or distance? Or do I just want peace? Those are very different goals. And the clearer I became with my goal, the clearer my next step became. And honestly, this is one of the reasons why I started this channel. Because so many high achieving women carry impossible responsibilities inside family relationships. We become the mediator, the fixer, the responsible one, the person trying to hold everything together. Learning what belongs to us and what doesn't is some of the most important work we'll ever do. And if that resonates with you, I'd love you to join us here and click that little subscribe button down below. One realization that surprised me was this: understanding only requires one person, but repair requires two. I could understand my parents. I could develop empathy. I could recognize their inherited patterns. I could stop blaming. But repair required participation from both sides. Not perfection, not agreement, participation. A willingness to listen, to stay in uncomfortable conversations, to have the willingness to acknowledge impact on both sides, and to try something different moving forward. And honestly, that realization was freeing because it helped me stop carrying responsibility for things that were never mine to carry alone. When you think about repairing a relationship, don't ask, are they doing everything right? You should ask, is there movement? Are they willing to listen? Are they curious? Can they tolerate difficult conversations? Do they make some effort, even if it's imperfect? Because healthy relationships aren't built from perfection, they're built from willingness. And it's from that small sign of willingness tells us far more than perfect words ever could. Something I didn't expect was that in my search for understanding my parents, it created both compassion and more distance at the same time. I could understand why certain behaviors existed. I could see where they came from. I could even feel empathy. But understanding didn't automatically make those behavior healthy for me. And that was an important lesson. Because empathy and boundaries can exist together. Compassion and distance can exist together. Understanding and self-protection can exist together. And those things are not opposites. I have an exercise for those of you who are considering cutting off a family member. I want you to take out a notebook, and on a page, I want you to answer the following questions honestly. What do I want from this relationship today? Not 5 years ago, but today. What evidence do I see that repair is possible? What evidence do I see that repair is not possible? And finally, am I trying to rebuild a relationship with the parent I have or the parent I wish I had? Don't rush that last question. It may be the most important question in the entire exercise. One of the hardest things I've learned through this process is that healing doesn't always produce the outcome we imagined. Sometimes healing leads to reconciliation. Sometimes it leads to healthier boundaries. Sometimes it leads to acceptance. And sometimes it leads to distance. But what healing consistently gives us is clarity. And clarity is powerful. Because once we see things clearly, we stop making decisions from old wounds, old fantasies, and old hopes. And we start making decisions from truth. Luckily for me, I was able to repair my relationship with my parents. But it required a lot of work, a lot of false starts, a lot of hard conversations, and some tears. And whether your path leads towards repair, stronger boundaries, or greater distance, my hope is that the decision comes from wisdom rather than pain alone. Because this relationship is too important and the consequences too far-reaching to be decided by hurt in a single moment. It deserves reflection. It deserves honesty. And most importantly, it deserves a version of you that is no longer operating from old family patterns. All right. I think that's enough for now. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.